the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates that transcend death itself. There are torments that stretch beyond the comprehension of mortal minds, and there are prisons from which even the most devoted servants of the Emperor cannot escape. Today, we explore one of the most horrifying scenarios imaginable in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, a nightmare that combines the psychological horror of Dreadnought existence with the brutal, unknowing desecration of Ork technology. We're going to examine what happens when the Greenskins capture something they cannot possibly understand, when Xenos hands tear into sacred Imperial machinery, when a Grey Knight's Dreadnought, silent and sleeping for 1,750 years, falls into the clutches of the Orks. This is not a tale of simple destruction. It is not a story of honorable death in battle or glorious sacrifice. This is something far darker. This is the slow corruption of the incorruptible, the profaning of the sacred, the awakening of a consciousness that should have remained in blessed darkness, brought screaming back into a reality more terrible than any demon's domain. To understand the full horror of this scenario, we must first understand what a Grey Knight's Dreadnought truly is, and why 1,750 years of sleep makes this fate all the more unimaginable. The Grey Knights and their walking tombs. The Grey Knights are not simply space marines. They are the Emperor's demon hunters, the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus, the secret chapter whose very existence is classified at the highest levels of the Imperium. Every single battle brother is a psyker, their minds fortified against the whispers of the warp, their souls tempered in ways that would shatter lesser men. They are humanity's ultimate weapon against the forces of chaos, warriors who have never, not once in their 10,000-year history, fallen to corruption. When a Grey Knight falls in battle, truly falls with wounds so catastrophic that even their enhanced physiology cannot heal, the chapter faces a terrible decision. Unlike other chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, the Grey Knights do not view internment in a Dreadnought as an honor. They do not celebrate it as a chance for continued service. For the Grey Knights, to be sealed within a walking tomb is viewed as a burden almost too great to bear. Most of their battle brothers, when mortally wounded, simply wish to rest. They long to be laid in the cool darkness of the dead fields beneath their fortress monastery on Titan, to sleep away eternity in peace after a lifetime of war against the Imperium's most terrible denizens. But sometimes, the chapter cannot afford to lose a warrior's knowledge. Sometimes, a Grey Knight's experience with a particular breed of demon, his understanding of specific warp entities, or his mastery of psychic techniques is too valuable to let slip into death's embrace. In these rare cases, the fallen warrior is given a choice, a nod of the head, a single gesture of consent. And if that gesture comes, the tech marines and apothecaries begin their work. The process is no less horrific for a Grey Knight than for any other space marine. What remains of the body, perhaps just a torso and head, sections of spine, vital organs barely functioning, is carefully extracted from ruined armor. The broken flesh is placed within a sarcophagus, a metal womb filled with amniotic fluid, so cold it numbs whatever nerves still function. Neural links are hardwired directly into what's left of the nervous system. The mind impulse unit connects the remnants of the brain to the Dreadnought's mechanical systems. And then, most terrible of all, the sarcophagus is sealed. Forever. But a Grey Knight's Dreadnought is not like others of its kind. The chassis itself is covered with the Aegis, a complex network of protective prayers, sacred runes, and psychically charged wards inscribed into every surface. These wards are not mere decoration. They are active psychic defenses, barriers against the corruption of the warp that the Grey Knights face in every battle. The Dreadnought's weapons are blessed with silver, inscribed with names of power that burn demons on contact. The very metal of the walker is sanctified, treated with unguents and oils that have been blessed by the chapter's librarians. And the pilot within, that broken remnant of a once mighty warrior, remains a psyker. His connection to the warp does not fade with internment. If anything, sealed within the Dreadnaught's shell, separated from physical sensation, his psychic awareness becomes sharper, more focused. He can sense the presence of demonic entities. He can feel the ebb and flow of warp energies. He can link his Aegis field to those of his battle brothers, creating chains of psychic protection that can turn aside even the mightiest sorceries. But this psychic sensitivity comes at a cost. The Grey Knight within the Dreadnought feels everything. He senses corruption like a physical pain. He perceives the taint of chaos as others might feel fire on their skin. Every battle against demons is not just a physical struggle, but a psychic ordeal, a constant battle to maintain his mental wards while his enhanced senses scream warnings of spiritual danger. It is exhausting in ways that non-psychers cannot comprehend. It is a burden that weighs on the soul with every waking moment. This is why, after battle, after the demons are banished and the warp rifts sealed, the Grey Knight's Dreadnought is returned to the depths of the fortress monastery. The Tech Marines perform the sacred rites of shutdown. The chaplains speak the prayers of rest. And slowly, mercifully, the pilot's consciousness fades into stasis sleep. The cold darkness takes him, and for a time, there is peace. The abyss of 17 centuries, 1750 years. To a human, this is an incomprehensible span of time. It is longer than recorded history for many civilizations. It encompasses the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of cultures, the transformation of entire worlds. For a space marine entombed in a dreadnought, 1750 years of sleep is something else entirely. It is an eternity of darkness punctuated by brief, violent awakenings that blur together like fever dreams. The stasis sleep of a dreadnought is not like normal rest. It is not the gentle slumber of ordinary humans, where dreams carry the mind to distant places and memories play out in symbolic form. It is not even the suspended animation of the Susan membrane, where a space marine's consciousness simply switches off until needed. Dreadnought stasis is something darker, something more akin to death itself. The pilot's consciousness does not dream, it does not wander, it simply ceases to be, caught in a void so complete that when awakening comes, there is always a moment of existential terror. A moment when the pilot wonders if he ever existed at all. But the awakenings do come, must come, for a dreadnought is a weapon, and weapons must be wielded. Every few decades, perhaps every century if the chapter is fortunate, the summons arrives, a demonic incursion that requires the Ancient One's knowledge, a warp rift that must be sealed, a threat that demands every available warrior. The Tech Marines activate the awakening protocols. The amniotic fluid warms. Neural connections pulse with energy. And slowly, agonizingly, consciousness returns. Each time, it gets harder. Each awakening brings confusion that lasts longer, disorientation that cuts deeper. The pilot struggles to remember where he is, when he is, who he is. The faces of battle brothers he knew are gone, replaced by warriors who were not even born when last he fought. The chapter itself has changed, evolved, adapted to new threats and new strategies. The galaxy has moved on while he slept, and he must scramble to understand a present that feels alien and strange. For a Grey Knight, this disconnection is particularly acute. The chapter's methods of demon hunting are constantly evolving. New true names of warp entities are learned. Old rituals are refined or replaced. A Grey Knight, who last fought in the 37th Millennium, awakens to find that half of what he knew is outdated, that the demons he specialized in combating have been banished or have evolved new forms. His knowledge is still valuable, yes, but it is knowledge of a past that is increasingly distant from the present reality. And then There are the memories that do fade, the personal connections that blur and disappear despite all efforts to hold on to them. The face of a battle brother who fought beside him in his first campaign. The name of a librarian who taught him a particular psychic technique. The sound of his own voice before it was replaced by mechanical vox speakers. These things slip away like water through fingers, eroded by the sheer weight of centuries spent in darkness. After 1750 years, a Dreadnought pilot has been awakened dozens of times, perhaps even hundreds. Each awakening has stripped away another layer of his former self, another connection to who he once was. The process is gradual, but inexorable. The man becomes the machine, not because the machine overwrites him, but because the man simply forgets what it was like to be anything else. The pilot's identity fragments, scattered across ages like debris from an explosion, until all that remains is purpose, duty, and the ingrained training of a Grey Knight's discipline. Imagine then this existence. 17 centuries of darkness, broken by brief periods of consciousness, so disorienting they might as well be nightmares. 17 centuries during which the galaxy has changed beyond recognition. 17 centuries during which everyone you knew, everyone who knew you as a living warrior, has long since turned to dust. 17 centuries of forgetting your own humanity, one memory at a time, until you're not entirely sure what you're forgetting anymore. Now imagine awakening from that darkness, not to the familiar halls of your fortress monastery, not to the respectful faces of your battle brothers, not to the sacred litanies of the tech marines performing activation rites. Imagine awakening to the sensation of crude tools tearing at your sarcophagus, to the guttural laughter of Xenos, to the unmistakable psychic stench of green-skin presence all around you. Imagine awakening to find that you have been captured by Orks. The nature of the beast. To understand the true horror of what happens when Orks capture a Dreadnought, we must first understand what Orks are and how they think. The Greenskins are not simply savage aliens. They are not merely brutal warriors who live for combat. They are something far stranger, something that defies conventional understanding of biology, physics, and technology itself. They are creatures whose very existence bends reality around them through the power of collective belief. The Orks were created millions of years ago by the Old Ones, the ancient beings who once ruled the galaxy. They were designed as soldiers, living weapons in the war in heaven against the Citan and their Necrontyr servants. The Old Ones engineered into Ork genetics everything needed for them to be a self-sustaining warrior race. They reproduce through spores released when they die, ensuring that every battlefield becomes a breeding ground for more greenskins. They possess instinctive knowledge of technology, coded into their very DNA, allowing them to build and maintain weapons with minimal training. But the Old Ones went further than simple genetic engineering. They gave the Orks something else, something that would allow their creations to thrive in the most hostile environments imaginable. They gave them a gestalt psychic field, a collective unconscious that links every Ork to every other Ork in a way that profoundly affects reality itself. This field is not controlled consciously. Individual Orks have virtually no psychic power of their own, unlike their Eldar cousins. But together, when enough Orks gather in one place, their combined belief in something can actually make it real. This is not unlimited reality warping. The Gestalt field has limits, rules, boundaries that cannot be crossed. An Ork cannot simply believe a rock is a gun and have it function as such. But what the field can do is push technology that is almost functional into actually working. It can make a gun that should jam after 3 shots keep firing for 300. It can make an engine that should explode on startup run for years. It can make armor plating that is too thin to stop a bullet somehow deflect las rounds. The effect is stronger the more Orks there are and the more they believe in something. A lone Orks shooter might barely work at all, but when that Ork is part of a great horde, when thousands of greenskins all believe that shooters go daka daka daka, suddenly that ramshackle weapon becomes frighteningly effective. When an entire warband believes that red vehicles go faster, their crude buggies and trucks genuinely do achieve higher speeds than physics should allow. This is where the mech boys come in, those orcs who possess an enhanced version of the techno gene that all greenskins carry. Mech boys do not learn engineering the way humans do. They do not study blueprints or perform calculations. Instead, they know how to build things the way a bird knows how to fly, or a spider knows how to spin a web. It is pure instinct, genetically encoded knowledge that bubbles up from their DNA when they need it. A mech boy looks at a pile of scrap and sees a truck waiting to be assembled. He sees which pieces need to go where, which bits need to be bashed into shape, which parts are missing and need to be looted from elsewhere. He works with an intuitive understanding that makes perfect sense to him, but which would baffle any human engineer. He'll weld pieces together that have no business working in combination. He'll wire systems in ways that violate every principle of electrical engineering. He'll bolt weapons onto chassis that should collapse under their weight. And somehow, impossibly, it works. The truck runs. The gun fires. The rocket launches into the sky and only explodes when it hits the enemy instead of the orc who fired it. This is not because the mech boy understands the physics involved or because he's accidentally created something functional. It works because the mech boy believes it will work, and that belief, amplified by the gestalt field of all the other orcs around him, makes reality bend just enough to allow it. But perhaps most important for understanding what happens to a captured dreadnought, we must understand orc culture and their relationship with looting. Orcs are obsessed with stuff, with acquiring more and better war gear, with taking trophies from fallen enemies. Among the clans, the Death Skulls have made looting into an art form, believing that stolen goods are inherently luckier than anything they could build themselves. But the impulse to loot, to scavenge, to improve themselves with taken goods is universal across all greenskin society. When orcs find a piece of enemy equipment, they do not simply admire it or preserve it as a trophy. They immediately begin thinking about how to use it, how to improve it, how to make it more orky. A looted Imperial tank gets bigger guns bolted onto it. A captured Eldar weapon gets reinforced with crude metal plating. A Space Marine's helmet becomes a decoration on a warboss's armor. Nothing is sacred to the orcs. Nothing is too holy or too advanced to be scavenged and repurposed. And this brings us to the central horror of our scenario. When orcs encounter a dreadnought, they do not see a sacred relic. They do not recognize the tragedy of the warrior trapped inside. They see a big stompy thing with lots of shooty bits and choppy bits. They see something valuable, something powerful, something worth taking. They see their next great project. The capture. The battle had been going poorly from the start. A Grey Knight's strike force, dispatched to a world on the eastern fringe to investigate reports of warp rifts, had found themselves facing not demons, but a massive orc horde that had swept across the sector. The greenskins had apparently been drawn to the psychic emanations from the warp instability, their weird boys sensing the power and leading their warbands toward what they thought would be a right proper scrap. What followed was brutal, even by Imperial standards. The Grey Knights, specialists in demon hunting and warpcraft, found their expertise poorly suited to fighting an enemy that came in endless green waves. Their psychic powers, so effective against creatures of the Imperium, had limited effect on orcs, who barely registered as sentient on a psychic level. Their sacred weapons, blessed to banish demons back to the warp, were reduced to being simply very good swords and bolters against foes that only understood physical violence. The strike force fought with the discipline and skill that defined the Grey Knights, but they were outnumbered 10,000 to 1. The orcs kept coming, kept swarming, kept throwing bodies at the silver-armored warriors with gleeful abandon. For every greenskin that fell, 2 more seemed to emerge from the jungle, bellowing their war cries and firing wildly into the melee. In desperation, the Grey Knight's Grand Master authorized the awakening of the Ancients. Deep in the strike cruiser's vault, Tech Marines hurried to activate dreadnoughts that had slept for centuries. Among them was Brother Ancient Caledon, a veteran of battles so old that the worlds he had fought on no longer existed. He had been interred in his dreadnought chassis during the 39th Millennium, wounded beyond recovery while banishing a greater demon of Sinch. For 1750 years, he had slept between brief awakenings, his consciousness spending less time in the waking world than in the darkness of stasis. The awakening protocols were rushed, shortened from their normal hours-long ceremony to mere minutes. Caledon's consciousness surfaced sluggishly from the void, confusion and disorientation, making his first moments of awareness a chaotic swirl of half-remembered battles and unclear purpose. The Tech Marine activating him spoke quickly, urgently, explaining the situation in clipped battle cant. Orks, horde, holding action needed, no time for full briefing. Caledon's dreadnought chassis, an ancient Castroferrum pattern covered in 17 centuries of battle honors and psychic wards, was loaded into a drop pod and launched toward the surface. The descent was violent, the pod shaking as it tore through the atmosphere and slammed into the jungle canopy. When the doors blew open, Caledon stomped forth into a nightmare of green flesh and crude weaponry. For several hours, he fought as he had been built to fight. His assault cannon roared, cutting through orcs like a scythe through wheat. His doom glaive, a massive force weapon that hummed with psychic energy, crushed skulls and rent armor with each swing. Around him, his Grey Knights battle brothers fought in perfect coordination, their tactical squads using the Dreadnought as an anchor point for their formation. But the Greenskins kept coming, and slowly, inevitably, the Grey Knights were forced to fall back. The order came to retreat to the extraction point, to abandon this world to the Orks, and return to the strike cruiser. The Grey Knights began their fighting withdrawal, maintaining discipline even as they gave ground, and that's when the Ork artillery found its range. The crude but devastating weapons, barely more than tubes filled with explosives and scrap metal, began raining down on the retreating Imperial forces. One shell, more lucky than accurate, struck the ground directly beside Caledon's dreadnought. The explosion lifted his massive chassis and threw it sideways into a ravine, tons of ceramite and adamantium tumbling end over end down a steep slope. When Caledon's awareness returned from the shock of the impact, he found himself on his back at the bottom of the ravine, one leg twisted beneath him at an angle that indicated severe damage to the hip joint. His assault cannon was torn from its mounting, buried somewhere in the dirt around him. Systems warnings flashed across his vision, indicating damage to gyro stabilizers, motive units, and power distribution. He tried to rise, but his damaged leg would not support his weight, and he crashed back down into the mud. Above him, he could hear the sounds of the battle moving away, the Grey Knights continuing their retreat toward the extraction point. He tried to broadcast on the Vox, to let them know his position, but found that his communication systems had been damaged in the fall. He could receive signals, could hear the tactical chatter as his battle brothers coordinated their withdrawal, but he could not transmit, could not call for help, could not warn them that he was separated and immobile. He tried to self-repair, activating backup systems and attempting to reroute power around damaged circuits. But the damage was too severe, too systemic. Without the ministrations of a Tech Marine and proper equipment, he would not be moving under his own power. He was stuck, helpless, a war machine reduced to an immobile statue of ceramite and prayer. And then he heard it, the sound that chilled what remained of his human consciousness to its core. Orc voices, crude and guttural, echoing down from the ravine's edge. The Greenskins had heard his fall, had come to investigate what had tumbled into this steep-sided gully, and what they found made them whoop with delight. Through his optical sensors, Caledon watched as the first orc peered over the edge of the ravine. It was a massive specimen, easily the size of a Terminator, with tusks like daggers and eyes that gleamed with malicious intelligence. It bellowed something in its harsh language, And more greenskins appeared, gathering at the ravine's edge and staring down at the fallen Dreadnought. Caledon tried to bring his weapons to bear, but the Doomglaive was trapped beneath his bulk, and his assault cannon was gone. His storm bolter, built into his chassis, had ammunition but could not angle high enough to target the Orks above him. He was helpless, completely at their mercy, and Orks had no concept of mercy. What followed was a debate, if such a word could be applied to the bellowing, shoving, and occasional punching that Orks engaged in when making decisions. The greenskins argued about what to do with their find. Some wanted to smash it, others wanted to loot its weapons. A few suggested just leaving it because it was too heavy to move. But one Ork, larger than the others and wearing what appeared to be a hat made from a Space Marine's helmet, had a different idea. This Ork, whom the others called Mech Boss Grit Stomper, had built a reputation among the warband for his ability to make anything work, even Yumi stuff. He had looted Imperial tanks and gotten them running again with Orky improvements. He had captured Eldar equipment and figured out how to use it, sort of. And now, staring down at the fallen Dreadnought, he saw the ultimate challenge, the pinnacle of his looting career. He saw a chance to claim a walking war machine for the greenskins. Grit Stomper's plan was ambitious. His boys would dig out the ravine's sides, creating a crude ramp. They would use chains and cables scavenged from destroyed vehicles to drag the Dreadnought up and out. They would load it onto the biggest transport they had and bring it back to their base. And there, in Grit Stomper's workshop, they would make this shiny git work for the Orks. The other greenskins loved this idea. The thought of having their own stompy walker, one painted in proper Orky colours and covered in spikes and trophies, filled them with enthusiasm. They set to work immediately, digging and hauling with the tireless energy that only Orks possess when working toward violence. Caledon watched all of this with growing horror. He tried to resist, tried to activate any system that might prevent his capture. He attempted to overload his power plant, to trigger a meltdown that would destroy his chassis and take the Orks with him. But the safety protocols, designed by tech priests millennia ago to prevent precisely such self-destruction, held firm. He could not end himself, could not deny the enemy this prize. It took the Orks 2 days to extract the Dreadnought from the ravine, 2 days during which Caledon's consciousness remained fully active, forced to endure every moment of his ignoble fate. He felt the chains wrap around his chassis, felt the grinding scrape of his armor against stone as the Orks dragged him upward, felt the rough handling as they loaded him onto a transport truck that groaned under his weight. And all the while, he could hear the Vox chatter from his chapter. The Grey Knights had successfully extracted from the planet. They had searched for him, had sent scouts back to his last known position. But the Orks had already moved him, and the ravine where he had fallen showed only signs of recent greenskin activity. After 3 days of searching, the Grand Master made the decision that all commanders dread. He declared Brother Ancient Caledon lost in battle, likely destroyed in the artillery barrage that had separated him from his brothers. Rites would be said for him. His name would be inscribed in the chapter's records as having fallen in service to the Emperor. His empty sarcophagus would be placed in the dead fields, marking the loss of a warrior whose deeds would be remembered for centuries to come. But Caledon was not dead. He was very much alive, very much conscious, and being transported deep into Ork territory toward a fate that no amount of Grey Knight's training could have prepared him for. The Workshop of Horrors. Grit Stomper's workshop was a monument to organized chaos, if organized could be applied to anything Orky. It occupied what had once been an imperial manufactorum, a vast industrial complex that the greenskins had conquered and promptly filled with their crude machinery. The space was enormous, tall enough to house Stompus and Gargants, wide enough that dozens of mech boys could work on projects simultaneously. The air was thick with smoke from countless forges and welding torches. The floor was covered in a layer of scrap metal, oil, and other substances best left unidentified. Gretchen scurried everywhere, carrying tools, fetching parts, and occasionally being kicked aside by larger Orks. The noise was deafening. a constant cacophony of hammering, grinding, shouting, and the occasional explosion when someone's project went spectacularly wrong. When they brought in Caledon's Dreadnought chassis, still painted in the silver and red of the Grey Knights, every mech boy in the workshop stopped what they were doing to stare. The silence lasted perhaps 5 seconds before erupting into excited bellowing. Mech boys clustered around the fallen walker, examining it with the critical eye of mechanics who understood machinery in their bones, even if they couldn't explain how or why. Gritstomper pushed through the crowd, his heavy boots clanking on the metal floor. He walked slowly around the Dreadnought, occasionally reaching out to touch the ceramite plating, to trace the psychic wards inscribed there, to test the weight of the Stormbolter mount. His eyes, small and piggy, but surprisingly intelligent for an orc, took in every detail. "Right proper piece of work, this," he announced to his assembled mech boys. "Gonna take some thinking to get it working again, but once we do, it'll be the best stompy we ever had." Inside his sarcophagus, Caledon could only watch through his optical sensors as the orcs began their work. He tried to remain calm, to center himself with the mental disciplines all Grey Knights learned. But 1700 years of sleep had left those disciplines rusty, and the sheer wrongness of his situation made it difficult to focus. He was a weapon designed to fight demons, a walker blessed and consecrated to battle the forces of chaos. Now he was a trophy, a curiosity, a project for greenskins to tinker with. The first thing the mech boys did was attempt to activate him. They gathered around his chassis, examining the external controls and trying to figure out what made the shiny Yumi Stompy work. They pushed buttons, pulled levers, yanked on cables with the sort of mechanical sympathy that makes tech marines weep. Nothing happened, of course, because activating a Dreadnought requires specific rituals, the correct prayers, and a thorough understanding of its sacred systems. You do not simply turn one on like a light switch. Frustrated by their lack of success, the mech boys decided to try a more direct approach. They would open up the chassis and have a look at what was inside. Gritstomper ordered his boys to fetch cutting torches and prying tools, to bring the big hammers and the special opening wrenches they used when they wanted to get into sealed Imperial equipment. What followed was a systematic violation of everything the Dreadnought represented. The orcs began cutting through the armor plating, their crude torches slowly eating through ceramite that had been blessed by chaplains and inscribed with prayers of protection. They pried open access panels that were meant to be serviced only by tech marines who had spent years learning the proper rituals. They hammered at seals that had been closed for 17 centuries, breaking sacred bonds with brutal force. Caledon felt every cut, every impact, not as physical pain, but as a violation. His sensory systems translated the damage to his chassis as wrongness, as corruptions of his physical form. More than that, his psychic senses screamed warnings as the orcs damaged the Aegis wards covering his armor. Each broken rune, each severed prayer scroll, each marred inscription of protection was like a small wound to his soul. The carefully maintained psychic defenses that had shielded him from chaos for 17 centuries were being destroyed, casually, by beings who did not even understand what they were doing. The orcs chattered excitedly as they worked, commenting on the weird squigglies that covered the Dreadnought's armor. Some thought the inscriptions were decorative, others believed they were directions for assembly. One particularly dim mech boy suggested they might be weak spots and should be cut away first. Gritstomper, who had a better understanding of enemy technology than most, suspected the markings were important somehow, but couldn't figure out what they did. In the end, he decided they didn't matter. What mattered was getting the Stompy to work, and that meant getting inside. After several days of cutting and prying, the mech boys finally managed to expose the Dreadnought's internal systems. They stared in confusion at the maze of cables, cogitators, and sacred machinery that kept the ancient walker functioning. It looked nothing like orc technology, which made a certain crude sense, even to the greenskins themselves. This was precise, intricate, almost delicate in places. It was the opposite of orky engineering. But mech boys are nothing if not confident in their abilities. Gritstomper began pointing out components and issuing orders. That bit there, That looked like a power source. Those cables, those probably carried electricity. That big round thing, that might be important. Better not smash it just yet. The mech boys nodded along, their genetically encoded knowledge of technology letting them make vague sense of what they were seeing. And then one of them noticed the sarcophagus. The armored tomb at the Dreadnought's heart was unlike anything the Orks had seen before. It was sealed tight, covered in more of those weird squigglies, and had tubes and cables running into it from all directions. The mech boy who noticed it pointed and grunted a question to Grit Stomper. "What's that thing?" Grit Stomper leaned in close, examining the sarcophagus with interest. He could see faint lights pulsing behind vision ports, could hear a very faint humming coming from within. Something was inside there, something that was still working despite all the damage they'd done to the outer chassis. "Dunno," Grit Stomper admitted. "But it looks important. Better open it up and have a look." This was the moment Caledon had been dreading. The sarcophagus was the last sanctuary, the final barrier between what remained of his human flesh and the outside world. It had been sealed when he was first interred, 17 centuries ago, and was never meant to be opened again, except by the most skilled tech marines in the most controlled environments. To open it here, in an Ork workshop, with crude tools and no understanding of the delicate life support systems within, was to invite death. But death, Caledon realized with growing despair, might be preferable to what came next. The Orks began working on the sarcophagus seals. They tried prying first, but the adamantium shell was too strong. They tried cutting, but their torches struggled against the reinforced metal. Finally, in frustration, one of them suggested they just hit it really hard with a hammer until something broke. This was accepted as sound Orky logic, and they set to work with the largest hammers they could find. The impacts rang through Caledon's awareness like gongs, each strike sending shockwaves through the amniotic fluid that surrounded his physical form. His vital signs monitors showed his heart rate increasing, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. After 1,700 years of stasis, his body was not prepared for this kind of stress. Finally, with a screech of tearing metal, one of the seals gave way. The Orks cheered and redoubled their efforts, hammering at the weakened point until they managed to pry open a section of the sarcophagus shell. The moment they did, alarms began shrieking throughout the Dreadnought systems. The breach had compromised the atmospheric seal, and cold air from the workshop was beginning to mix with the carefully maintained environment within. What the Orks saw when they peered into the open sarcophagus would have horrified most beings. Inside, bathed in thick, oil-like amniotic fluid, was what remained of Brother Caledon's physical form. It was barely recognizable as human. Just a torso, portions of a spine, a head whose skull had been partially replaced with metal, and clusters of vital organs kept alive by the miracle of Imperial technology. Cables and neural links pierced the flesh at dozens of points, connecting what was left of the Grey Knight to the Dreadnought systems. The Orks found it fascinating. They poked at the fluid, commented on the weird little Yumi, and argued about whether this was the pilot or just some kind of organic component. Grit Stomper stared for a long time, his crude mind trying to process what he was seeing. Eventually, he arrived at a conclusion that was both accurate and horrifying in its implications. "It's like a killer can," he announced. "Little Yumi stuck into metal suit to make it go. But this one's all broken-like, not stomping around. We gotta fix him up, make him work proper." The other mech boys nodded enthusiastically. They understood killer Khans, which were smaller versions of dreadnoughts that the Orks built by stuffing Gretchen into metal shells and giving them weapons. If this was just a really fancy killer can with a Yumi instead of a grot, then they knew what to do. They needed to get it powered up, connect everything properly, and make sure the little Yumi could control the Stompy. What followed was a disaster from any sane perspective, but which the Orks considered perfectly reasonable engineering. They began reconnecting systems, but without understanding what anything did, they reconnected them wrong. Power cables meant for weapon systems were plugged into sensor arrays. Neural links were reversed or doubled up. Cooling systems were routed into ammunition feeds. They did all of this while the sarcophagus remained partially open, exposing Caledon's ravaged body to the contaminated air of the workshop. Through it all, Caledon remained conscious, aware of every violation, every wrong connection, every brutal modification. His psychic senses, no longer shielded by the intact Aegis wards, were being assaulted by the gestalt field of the Orks all around him. He could feel their presence like insects crawling over his consciousness, their crude psychic emanations pressing against his mind in ways that made his trained mental defenses strain to hold. And then, after weeks of this torture, Grittstomper decided they needed to add some Orky improvements to make the Stompy properly brutal. This meant welding additional armor plates to the chassis, plates torn from destroyed Imperial vehicles and beaten into roughly the right shape. It meant bolting on extra weapons, crude Ork shooters and choppers that had no business being attached to a Dreadnought. It meant painting over the sacred silver of the Grey Knights with garish greenskin colors. But worst of all, it meant adding Go Faster stripes, lucky colors, and other decorations that the Orks believed would make their captured walker more effective. Red paint for speed, checkerboard patterns for better accuracy, horned decorations to make it more scary-like. Each addition was another corruption, another step away from what the Dreadnought had been and towards something that should not exist. The final modification, the one that would prove most significant, came when Grittstomper decided the Dreadnought needed a proper Orky power source. The original system was still functioning, but the mech boss wanted something with more oomph, something that could handle all the additional weapons and systems they had bolted on. So he welded a crude Ork power generator directly into the chassis, connecting it to the Imperial systems with typical greenskin disregard for compatibility or safety. The generator was a barely controlled fusion reaction wrapped in scrap metal and hope. It ran hot, much hotter than the original power plant, and it leaked radiation that would have killed an unprotected human in hours. But Orks were tough, and they assumed their new Stompy would be too. They activated the generator, watched it sputter to life with a sound like grinding teeth, and declared it proper brutal. Inside his sarcophagus, Caledon felt the new power source come online. It was wrong in every way, wrong in ways his training had never prepared him for. The energy it produced was tainted, corrupted by its Orky origins and the gestalt field that surrounded it. It flowed through the neural connections into his body, into his very consciousness, carrying with it something that should not be there. The Orks stood back, admiring their work. The Dreadnought was barely recognizable as Imperial anymore. It was covered in green paint, crude Ork symbols, and random mechanical additions that gave it the appearance of a greenskin war machine. The beautiful inscriptions of the Grey Knights were hidden beneath layers of graffiti. The sacred Aegis wards were broken, defiled, rendered useless by the Orks' crude modifications. Grittstomper nodded with satisfaction. "Right, Den! Let's fire him up and see if the little Yumi can make him walk." And with those words, he activated the awakening sequence that his mech boys had cobbled together from the Dreadnought's systems. Power surged through the chassis. Systems that had been dormant began to initialize. Neural connections that had been severed and reconnected incorrectly started transmitting signals to Caledon's brain. After 1750 years of sleep, after weeks of being helplessly aware while Orks tore apart his sacred tomb, Brother Ancient Caledon was about to experience something worse than death. He was about to be forced to truly awaken, to take control of a body that was no longer his own, that had been corrupted and profaned beyond any hope of redemption. He was about to become a Grey Knight's Dreadnought in service to the Orks. The terrible awakening. The first sensation was pain, which was appropriate because pain was all that Caledon had known for the past several weeks. But this was different. This was not the psychic agony of feeling the Aegis wards being destroyed, or the horror of watching Orks pry open his sarcophagus. This was physical pain, the kind that came from nerve endings that had been dormant for 17 centuries, suddenly being forced back into service. The amniotic fluid in his sarcophagus had been contaminated when the Orks breached the seals. What should have been a sterile, numbing solution was now a mixture of that fluid and whatever chemicals had leaked in from the workshop. It stung against his exposed flesh, bringing every nerve ending to screaming awareness. His lungs, which had grown accustomed to breathing the thick fluid, suddenly found it foreign and wrong. But that was just the beginning. As the activation sequence continued, power began flowing through the neural connections that linked Caledon's brain to the Dreadnought's systems. These connections, which should have transmitted clean signals through properly calibrated interfaces, were now carrying corrupted data through incorrectly wired pathways. The result was a sensory nightmare that threatened to overwhelm his consciousness entirely. His vision flickered between multiple overlapping feeds. The optical sensors, which the Orks had rewired, were sending conflicting data about what was in front of the Dreadnought, what was to its sides, what was behind it. His brain struggled to process the information, to make sense of a visual field that seemed to exist in 4 dimensions simultaneously. His hearing was worse. The audio pickups had been connected to what should have been his olfactory sensors, while actual sound was being routed through systems meant for tactical data. The result was that he could smell the Orks' guttural voices while hearing their scent as a cacophony of nonsensical noises. His sense of touch, what little remained through the Dreadnought's pressure sensors and gyroscopes, was scrambled beyond recognition. He could feel the workshop floor beneath his feet as if it were on his head. He could sense the Orks touching his chassis as pressure against organs that no longer existed in his physical body. Every sensation was displaced, inverted, or simply wrong in ways that defied description. A lesser being would have gone mad in the first seconds. A normal human would have retreated into catatonia, their minds simply shutting down rather than process such contradictory sensory input. Even a regular space marine might have fractured under the assault, their enhanced consciousness fragmenting into pieces. But Caledon was a grey knight, trained since childhood in mental discipline, hardened by 17 centuries of existence as a dreadnought, and gifted with psychic abilities that allowed him to perceive reality on levels beyond normal human senses. Instead of breaking, he fought. He drew on every scrap of training, every meditation technique, every mental fortress he had built during his millennia of service. He forced order onto chaos, imposed structure on madness, and slowly, agonizingly, began to make sense of what he was experiencing. His first coherent thought, filtering through the sensory storm, was simple and terrible. I am awake. His second thought was more complex. I am corrupted. He could feel it now, could sense with his psychic awareness what the Orks had done. The Dreadnought was not simply damaged or modified, it was tainted. The Orky additions, powered by the Greenskins' Gestalt field, were having an effect on his systems. The crude generator they had installed was pumping energy that carried the psychic signature of the Greenskins' collective consciousness. The weapons they had bolted on were not just physical additions, but channels for their belief to flow through. And worst of all, he could feel the Gestalt field itself beginning to affect him. The Orks believed this was their Stompy now, believed it would work for them because they had made it Orky, and their belief, amplified by dozens of mech boys all working toward the same goal, was starting to bend reality around the Dreadnought. Imperial systems that should have rejected the Orky modifications were finding ways to accommodate them. Power flows that should have been incompatible were somehow functioning. The crude welding and random connections that should have resulted in nothing but sparks and explosions were actually working, held together not by sound engineering, but by the sheer force of Orky belief that they should work. Caledon tried to resist, tried to use his psychic abilities to reject the corruption, to purge the taint from his systems. But his powers, formidable as they were, had been designed to fight demons and chaos corruption. They were specialized tools for specialized threats. What the Orks were doing was not chaos, not in the traditional sense. It was something else. something his training had never prepared him for. Outside the Dreadnought, the Orks were growing excited. Lights were flickering across the chassis as systems activated. The Walker's gyroscopes were whirring to life. Its weapons were powering up with sounds that were not quite right, but close enough to make the greenskins whoop with joy. They could see their modifications working, could watch as their captured Stompy came alive. Gritstomper stepped forward, his crude understanding of Imperial technology letting him recognize the signs of activation. "Do'umi's waking up," he bellowed. "Now we see if he can make it walk." Inside his sarcophagus, Caledon made a decision. He could continue to resist, could try to fight against the corruption, could attempt to override the Orky systems and force the Dreadnought to shut down. But that would take time he did not have, and would likely result in the Orks deciding their project was broken and should be smashed apart. They would kill him eventually, either deliberately or accidentally. He would die a contaminated failure, unable to warn his chapter of his fate, unable to complete his duty. Or he could accept what had happened. He could take control of this abomination that his Dreadnought had become. He could learn to work with the corrupted systems, to filter the sensory chaos into something usable, to function despite the violation of everything he had been. He could survive, and if he survived, perhaps he could find a way to escape, to return to the Grey Knights, to at least warn them of what the Orks had learned to do. The decision was made in a fraction of a second, but it would define everything that followed. Caledon stopped fighting the systems and instead embraced them. He opened his consciousness to the neural connections, accepted the scrambled sensory data, and began learning how to interpret the madness that surrounded him. His first attempt to move was clumsy. He tried to lift the Dreadnought's right arm, but the signal was misrouted and instead activated the left leg's servos. The Walker lurched sideways, nearly toppling over before Caledon compensated. The Orks cheered anyway, interpreting the stumble as proof that their Stompy was working. He tried again, this time accounting for the incorrect wiring. Right arm should be left leg. No, auxiliary power systems. Those feed to, yes, there. He activated what his brain told him was the wrong connection, and the right arm moved. It was progress. Over the next hour, Caledon painstakingly mapped out the new configuration of his body. What should have activated one system now controlled another. What should have been his vision was his hearing. What should have been simple movement required complex mental calculations to execute. But slowly, methodically, he built a new framework of understanding. He taught himself how to pilot this corrupted shell. The Orks watched with growing enthusiasm as the Dreadnought became more responsive. They saw it raise its arms, turn its torso, take its first stumbling steps. They saw it test its weapons, the targeting systems swiveling even if they couldn't tell the systems were working or wrong. They saw exactly what they wanted to see, their looted Stompy learning to work. What they could not see was the battle being fought inside the machine. Caledon was not just learning to control corrupted systems. He was fighting against the Gestalt field itself, which kept trying to impose Orky logic onto Imperial machinery. When he tried to fire his Stormbolter, the Gestalt field suggested it should make a loud Daka noise even when not actually shooting. When he attempted to move forward, the field kept insisting he should go faster because he was painted red. Every action was a negotiation between his will and the collective belief of the greenskins around him. And there was something else. Something that filled him with a horror deeper than any physical torment. He could feel himself beginning to change. The constant exposure to the Orky Gestalt field, the tainted power flowing through his neural connections, the sheer wrongness of his situation, all of it was affecting him on a fundamental level. His thoughts, which should have been clear and disciplined, were becoming tinged with something foreign. His reactions, honed by centuries of experience, were being influenced by patterns that were not his own. He was not becoming an Ork. That was impossible. But he was becoming something that was no longer purely a Grey Knight either. The corruption was subtle, insidious, creeping in through the connections between his mind and the machine. Every time he accepted the scrambled sensory input, Every time he worked within the parameters of the Orky modifications, he was changing, adapting, becoming more compatible with what they had made him into. After 3 hours of practice, Caledon could walk smoothly, could aim his weapons with reasonable accuracy, and could process the sensory chaos well enough to navigate the workshop without bumping into things. To an outside observer, the Dreadnought looked functional. The Orks certainly thought so, cheering and celebrating their success at making the Yumi stompy work. Gritstomper approached the Dreadnought, looking up at its battle-scarred chassis with satisfaction. "Right, Den. Little Yumi's learned how to drive. Now we gotta see if he can fight." And with that simple statement, Caledon's situation went from terrible to impossible. The Orks were going to make him fight. They were going to deploy him in battle, to use him as a weapon against whoever they decided to attack next. And if his psychic senses were correct, if the Vox chatter he could still pick up from Imperial forces was accurate, the Orks were planning to attack an Imperial Guard regiment that had recently landed on this world. Caledon would be forced to kill Imperial soldiers. Forced to fight for the Greenskins against humanity. Forced to become exactly what every Grey Knight feared most, a weapon turned against those he had sworn to protect. The chapter had declared him dead. The Imperium believed him destroyed. No one would know that the Ork Dreadnought advancing across the battlefield was piloted by a loyalist space marine screaming inside a prison of corrupted metal. No one would know that every shot he fired, every soldier he killed, was done while his consciousness wept with the horror of what he had become. The only thing worse than what had been done to him was what he was about to be forced to do to others. The Gestalt's corruption. In the days that followed his activation, Caledon was kept in the workshop while the Orks continued to improve him. These modifications ranged from the merely annoying, like adding more decorative spikes and kill markings, to the genuinely dangerous, like rewiring his weapons to carry more ammunition at the expense of safety protocols. Each change pushed him further from what he had been and deeper into the nightmare of what he was becoming. But the physical modifications were only part of the problem. The real danger was psychic, and it was growing worse with every hour he remained surrounded by Orks. The greenskin Gestalt field was not like chaos corruption. It did not whisper promises of power or offer temptations of forbidden knowledge. It did not assault his soul with demonic visions or try to break his faith in the Emperor. Instead, it simply pressed against his consciousness with the weight of collective belief, wearing down his resistance through sheer persistence. The Orks believed their stompy was Orky now. They believed it would fight with brutality and cunning. They believed its weapons would make satisfying noises, and its movements would be appropriately aggressive. And their belief, multiplied by dozens of greenskins, all maintaining the same general conviction, began to affect reality in ways that Caledon could feel but could not fully resist. His Stormbolter, a weapon that should fire with the precise, measured shots of Imperial manufacture, began to develop an echo. Not a real echo, not something that registered on acoustic sensors, but a psychic impression of sound that the Orks expected to hear. When he fired, they heard "daka daka daka," and their hearing that sound reinforced the Gestalt field's impression that the weapon should sound that way, which in turn made the weapon actually start to produce that sound, as if reality itself was being rewritten by their expectations. His movements, which he tried to keep controlled and measured as befitted a Grey Knight's war machine, began to take on a swagger. Not deliberately, not through any conscious choice on his part, but because the Orks expected their walker to move properly brutally. The Gestalt field pushed against his motor control, suggesting aggressive stances and threatening postures. When he tried to walk normally, the field made the motion feel wrong, uncomfortable. When he adopted a more Orky gait, stomping with exaggerated force and swinging his arms with theatrical menace, the field rewarded him with a sense of rightness that was disturbingly pleasant. This was the most insidious aspect of the corruption. It did not feel like corruption at all. It felt like adaptation, like learning to work within a new system, like becoming more effective at his assigned role. The Gestalt field was not trying to make him evil, it was trying to make him Orky. And there was a seductive simplicity to that transformation. Orks did not doubt. They did not question. They did not struggle with existential horror or wrestle with the meaning of their existence. They simply were, and in being, they found purpose. The field offered him that same simplicity, that same freedom from the crushing weight of self-awareness and duty. All he had to do was accept it, to let go of his Grey Knight's training and embrace the straightforward brutality of greenskin existence. He fought against it, of course, every time he felt the field pushing him toward Orky behavior. He resisted. Every time his thoughts began to simplify, to lose the complexity that defined human consciousness, he reasserted his mental disciplines. Every time the temptation to just accept this new reality grew strong, he reminded himself of who he was, what he was, and what he had sworn to defend. But the fight was exhausting, and he had no respite from it. The Orks never left him alone. There were always greenskins around, working on other projects in the workshop, chatting amongst themselves, or just passing by to admire their looted stompy. Their presence meant the Gestalt field was constantly active, constantly pressing against his psyche, constantly wearing down his resistance. Worse, he had to function within the corrupted systems. He had to use the Orky power generator, which meant accepting its tainted energy into his body. He had to operate the weapons they had installed, which meant working with technology that should not function but did, thanks to the field. Every action he took within this corrupted shell was a small surrender, a tiny acknowledgement that the Ork way worked, at least in some limited sense. And through it all, his psychic senses continued to register the damage to his Aegis wards. The protective inscriptions that had shielded him from chaos for 17 centuries were broken, defaced, painted over with Orky symbols. He could feel the absence of their protection like missing limbs, like gaps in armor through which danger could strike. Without the Aegis, he was vulnerable to warp corruption in ways he had never been before. If a demon were to appear now, if any significant chaos entity were to focus on him, he would have no defense beyond his own willpower. The Orks, of course, had no idea what they had done. They had destroyed defensive mechanisms they could not perceive, removed protections against threats they did not believe in. To them, the weird squigglies were just decorations, meaningless scribbles that cluttered up perfectly good metal. They had improved the stompy by removing the clutter and adding proper Orky glyphs that made sense. After a week of this constant psychic assault, Caledon noticed something that chilled him to his core. He was starting to understand Ork language, not through any conscious study, not through translation matrices or linguistic analysis, but through the Gestalt field itself. The Ork's crude speech was beginning to make intuitive sense, as if some part of his brain was being rewired to process their guttural syllables as meaningful communication. He tested this by listening to Gritstomper give orders to his mech boys. The words were barbaric, barely language at all by Imperial standards, but Caledon found he could follow the meaning. The mech boss was telling his subordinates to reinforce the left leg joint because it looked a bit wobbly-like. He was instructing them to add more dakka to the main weapon because you can never have enough dakka. He was planning to paint a big toothy grin on the Dreadnought's front plate because it'll make him look more scary. Caledon understood all of it. Worse, he found himself agreeing with some of it. The left leg joint did feel unstable after the Ork's modifications. Additional firepower would improve his combat effectiveness. The toothy grin was tactically nonsensical, but something in the Gestalt field whispered that it would make enemies more afraid. That belief in the terrifying appearance would make it actually more terrifying. He shut down that train of thought immediately, horrified at himself. These were Ork ideas, Orky logic, greenskin thinking infiltrating his Grey Knight's consciousness. He was not agreeing with the mech boss's plans because they made tactical sense. He was agreeing because the Gestalt field was influencing his judgment, because the constant exposure was breaking down the barriers between his thoughts and theirs. This was how it would happen, he realized. not through some dramatic transformation, not through a single moment of corruption, but through 1,000 small erosions. Each time he accepted Orky logic, each time he found himself thinking in their terms, each time he let the Gestalt field influence his decisions, he would lose a little more of himself. Eventually, there would be nothing left of Brother Ancient Caledon. There would only be a consciousness that had once been a Grey Knight, now so thoroughly adapted to Orky existence that the distinction no longer mattered. And the truly terrible part was that he could not simply shut himself down, could not retreat into stasis sleep and hope someone would rescue him. The Orks had control of his activation sequences now. If he tried to deactivate, they would simply turn him back on. If he refused to respond, they would tear into his systems again, would poke and prod and modify until he either complied or was destroyed. His only options were cooperation or death. And the survival instinct that had kept him fighting for 17 centuries would not let him choose death. So he cooperated. He let the mech boys add their modifications. He learned to pilot his corrupted shell with increasing skill. He prepared himself for deployment in Ork service, all while trying to maintain some core of his identity against the relentless psychic assault of the Gestalt field. But late at night, during the few hours when most of the Orks slept and the Gestalt field weakened slightly, Caledon would access his deepest memory cores. He would review files on Grey Knight's battles, on the chapter's history, on the sacred duty he had sworn to uphold. He would recite the litanies of protection, even though his Aegis wards were broken and the words had no power now. He would remind himself of his name, his rank, his brotherhood, everything that made him who he was. It was becoming harder to remember. The memories felt distant, like stories about someone else, someone who had died long ago. The Grey Knight seemed like a dream, the Imperium like a half-forgotten legend. What was real was the workshop, the Orks, the corrupted Dreadnought chassis he inhabited. What was real was the Gestalt field pressing against his mind, promising simplicity if he would just stop fighting. But he was a Grey Knight, trained to fight impossible battles against enemies that could not be defeated by conventional means. He had stood against greater demons and prevailed. He had banished demon princes back to the warp. He had held the line when reality itself was tearing apart. He would not surrender to a bunch of greenskins, no matter how insidious their corruption. He would survive this. He would maintain his identity. And somehow, some way, he would find a way to escape or die trying. The alternative, becoming a willing weapon in Ork hands, was literally unthinkable for a Grey Knight. Even if it meant enduring this psychological torture forever, even if it meant eventually going mad from the strain, he would not become what they wanted him to be. At least, that's what he told himself. But with each passing day, that conviction grew a little weaker, and the Gestalt field's influence grew a little stronger. Deployment and horror. The call to battle came on the 13th day of Caledon's captivity. A lookout had spotted an Imperial Guard column moving through the valley below the Ork stronghold, and the greenskins immediately began preparing for a raid. This was exactly the kind of opportunity they loved. A chance to ambush some Yumis, steal their stuff, and have a proper fight in the process. Grit Stomper saw it as the perfect opportunity to field test his looted Stompy. The Dreadnought had been working well in the workshop, but real combat would prove whether all their modifications held up under stress. He ordered his mech boys to load additional ammunition, check the power connections, and make sure the Yumi pilot was awake and ready. Inside his sarcophagus, Caledon felt the Orks' excitement through the Gestalt field. Their anticipation of violence created a psychic buzz that made his senses tingle, made his corrupted systems surge with energy they should not have possessed. The field was strongest when the greenskins were focused on combat, and right now, hundreds of Orks were all thinking about the same thing, the upcoming fight. He tried to access the Imperial Vox frequencies, hoping to warn the guard column of the ambush. His communication systems were still partially functional, though scrambled by Ork modifications. But when he attempted to transmit, nothing happened. The Orks had disabled his external communications, probably without even realizing what those systems were for. They had cut wires that looked not important, and broken connections that seemed a bit finicky. The result was that he could receive transmissions, but could not send them. So he could only listen as the guard column reported their position, as officers gave orders to their subordinates, as soldiers chatted on open channels about how quiet this world seemed. They had no idea what was waiting for them. No idea that within the hour they would be fighting for their lives against an Ork warband that included a corrupted Grey Knight's Dreadnought. The Orks loaded Caledon onto a massive transport truck, one of those ramshackle contraptions that seemed held together by optimism and rust. The journey to the ambush site was bouncy, violent, and accompanied by the Orks' bellowed war songs. Caledon tried to use the time to prepare himself mentally for what was coming, but there was no preparation adequate for what he was about to face. He was going to be forced to kill Imperial soldiers, men and women who served the Emperor, who had left their homes to fight in the Imperial Guard, who trusted that the Imperium's warriors would protect them, and he would be the instrument of their deaths. A Grey Knight's Dreadnought turned against the very people he had sworn to defend. The ambush site was a narrow section of the valley where the road passed between two steep hillsides. The Orks positioned themselves on both sides, their crude weapons aimed at the kill zone below. Caledon's Dreadnought was placed at the head of the formation, where he would be able to open fire on the lead vehicles as they entered the ambush. Through his scrambled sensors, he could see the Imperial column approaching. 3 Chimera transports, flanked by Sentinel walkers, with a Lehman Russ tank bringing up the rear. Perhaps 200 soldiers total, a standard reconnaissance force sent to scout this supposedly pacified world. They were moving cautiously, but not expecting serious resistance. The planetary governor had reported only scattered Ork presence. Nothing organized, nothing dangerous. The governor's intelligence was catastrophically wrong, but the guard would only realize that when it was too late. Gritstomper, who had positioned himself near Caledon's Dreadnought, raised his hand to signal the attack. The greenskins fell silent, an unusual state for Orks, but necessary for ambushes. They waited as the lead Chimera entered the kill zone, as the other vehicles followed, as the entire column moved into the perfect position. Then Gritstomper's hand fell, and the Orks opened fire. The valley erupted with violence. Rockets streaked from the hillsides, slamming into the Imperial vehicles. Big shooters sprayed bullets across the column. Ork boys began charging down the slopes, bellowing their war cries as they closed for melee. The guard, caught completely by surprise, struggled to respond to the sudden assault, and through it all, Caledon sat motionless, every fiber of his being screaming in protest at what he was being commanded to do. Gritstomper was shouting at him, ordering him to shoot, to smash, to kill. The other Orks were looking at their looted Stompy expectantly, waiting to see it prove itself in battle. The Gestalt field pressed against his consciousness, suggesting that fighting was what he was made for, that combat was good and proper and right. But he could not do it, could not bring himself to fire on those Imperial soldiers, could not force his corrupted systems to aim at men who served the Emperor. Every instinct, every shred of training, every core value he still possessed rejected the very concept. He was a Grey Knight. He protected humanity. He did not kill the Imperium's soldiers, no matter what form he had been forced to take. Gritstomper's shouting grew more insistent. The mech boss was standing right next to the Dreadnought now, hitting its leg with a wrench to get the Yumi's attention. "Shoot 'em, you git! What's the matter with ya?" In the kill zone below, the Imperial Guard was rallying. The Chimera's turrets swiveled, returning fire at the Ork positions. The Lehman Russ rumbled forward, its battle cannon speaking with authoritative voice. Guardsmen piled out of the transports, taking cover behind their vehicles and adding their laser guns to the firefight. They were outnumbered and ambushed, but they were fighting back with the discipline and courage that defined the Imperial Guard. And then one of the sentinels spotted Caledon's position, the walker's pilot. Seeing what appeared to be an Ork Dreadnought on the hillside, immediately targeted it with the sentinel's lascannon. The shot was accurate, searing across the distance, and impacting Caledon's right shoulder plate. The laser cut through the Orky armor additions and scored the ceramite beneath, sending damage warnings flashing across his vision. The impact decided the matter. The Sentinel's pilot had made a choice based on the information available. There was a walker on the hillside with the Orks, so it must be hostile. The pilot had no way of knowing the truth, could not perceive the screaming consciousness trapped inside the machine. All the guardsman saw was a target that needed to be eliminated. Caledon felt something break inside him. Not his resolve, not his resistance to the Orks, but something more fundamental. It was the recognition that from the outside, from the perspective of anyone who could see him, he was indistinguishable from an Ork war machine. The Imperial soldiers were right to shoot at him. They were doing their duty, defending themselves against what appeared to be a Xenos threat. They could not see the Grey Knight trapped inside, could not know the horror he was experiencing. And if they could not know, if there was no way to communicate the truth, then what did it matter what he did? The Imperium had already judged him by his appearance and found him worthy of destruction. His own brothers, if they could see him now, would probably order the same thing. He was corrupted, tainted, irrevocably changed by what the Orks had done. The Gestalt field, sensing the crack in his resolve, pushed harder. It whispered that fighting back was survival, that self-defense was natural, that the Yumis had fired first. It suggested that he was part of the Ork warband now, whether he wanted to be or not, and that meant fighting alongside them, against their enemies. Caledon's weapons armed themselves, almost without his conscious input. His targeting systems locked onto the Sentinel that had shot him. His Stormbolter elevated to the proper firing angle, and with a thought that felt both alien and familiar, he returned fire. The burst was accurate, too accurate for what the Orks expected, but within the parameters of what his Grey Knight's training allowed. The bolts struck the Sentinel's leg joints, exactly where Caledon knew they were most vulnerable. The walker stumbled, its pilot fighting to maintain balance, and then toppled sideways as its damaged leg gave way. The Orks cheered, interpreting the shot as their Stompy joining the fight. Gritstomper laughed and slapped the Dreadnought's leg again, this time in congratulation rather than reproof. "There you go! Give 'em what for!" And Caledon, his soul screaming in protest even as his body complied, did exactly that. He opened fire on the Imperial Guard, his weapons speaking with devastating accuracy. Every shot was perfectly placed, striking weak points and critical systems with the precision that only 1,700 years of combat experience could provide. He knew exactly how to disable a chimera with minimal shots, knew precisely where to hit a guardsman's flak armor to ensure penetration, knew the most efficient way to eliminate threats while conserving ammunition. The Guard forces, already struggling against superior Ork numbers, found themselves facing something far more dangerous than crude greenskin weapons. They found themselves targeted by what appeared to be an Ork Dreadnought, but fought with Space Marine skill. The combination was devastating. Within minutes, 2 of the chimeras were smoking wrecks, and the Sentinel squadron was reduced to burning wreckage. The Leman Russ, commanded by a veteran tank crew, recognized the Dreadnought as the primary threat and turned its battle cannon toward Caledon's position. The tank commander's voice, which Caledon could hear on the still functional Vox receivers, was calm and professional as he gave firing orders. The man was simply doing his job, eliminating an enemy war machine with the tools available to him. The battle cannon spoke, its shell screaming across the valley toward Caledon's position. He saw it coming, his enhanced sensors tracking its trajectory, and realized he could dodge. The Orky modifications to his motive systems, powered by the Gestalt field's belief in their effectiveness, had made him faster than a standard Dreadnought should be. He could avoid the shot, could survive to keep fighting. But to dodge would mean embracing the corruption fully, accepting the Ork modifications as beneficial, acknowledging that what they had done improved him. It would be the final surrender, the last step in becoming something that was no longer a Grey Knight, in any meaningful sense. For a fraction of a second, Caledon hesitated, part of him wanted to stand still, to take the shot, to let the Leman Russ do what he could not do to himself, end his existence as a corrupted monstrosity. It would be an honorable death of sorts, killed by Imperial forces while preventing himself from doing further harm. But the survival instinct was too strong, the same drive that had kept him fighting for 17 centuries, that had pulled him through countless battles and impossible situations, that had maintained his consciousness through ages of darkness. That instinct overrode his desire for death. His Dreadnought chassis moved, faster than it should have been able to, dodging to the side just as the battle cannon shell impacted where he had been standing. The Orks cheered again, impressed by their stompy's speed. The Gestalt field surged with approval, with belief that the red paint really did make him faster, that their modifications were working as intended, and Caledon felt that approval flow through his corrupted systems like a reward, like positive reinforcement for behavior he hated. He had fully crossed the line now. He was not just defending himself against attack. He was actively fighting alongside the Orks, using their modifications, accepting their influence, becoming the weapon they wanted him to be. The knowledge of this filled him with self-loathing, so intense, it was almost physical pain. But he kept fighting. His weapons kept firing, his chassis kept moving, and Imperial soldiers kept dying. The battle lasted another 20 minutes before the surviving guard forces managed to execute a fighting retreat. They had lost half their column, including both officers and most of their vehicles. The survivors, mostly infantry, disappeared into the valley's jungle terrain, pursued by whooping Orks, who were too busy looting the destroyed vehicles to give proper chase. Gritstomper approached Caledon's Dreadnought as the sounds of battle faded. The mech boss was grinning, his tusks stained with what Caledon hoped was just paint. "That was proper brutal, that was. You fought real good for a Yumi. Fought almost like a proper orc." The words, meant as high praise from the greenskin's perspective, struck Caledon like physical blows. He had fought like an orc. He had used orky tactics, orky weapons, orky modifications. He had killed Imperial soldiers while working alongside Xenos. And worst of all, part of him, a part that was growing larger every day, had found the battle satisfying. The combat, the violence, the simple clarity of kill or be killed. It had been almost restful after weeks of psychological torture. This was how it happened, he understood now. This was how corruption took hold, not through dramatic transformation or sudden evil, but through tiny compromises, through survival choices that eroded principles bit by bit. He'd convinced himself he was fighting in self-defense, but the truth was simpler and more terrible. He had fought because the alternative was death, and he was not ready to die. As the Orks began the process of loading him back onto the transport truck, Caledon retreated into his most secure mental fortress. He recited every litany of protection he knew, called upon every ounce of his Grey Knight's training, and tried to rebuild the walls around his identity that the Gestalt field had been eroding. But the walls were thinner now, more fragile, and the field was stronger than ever, reinforced by the Orks' belief that their looted Stompy was now battle-proven and properly brutal. Their conviction that he was theirs, that he belonged with the warband, that he was becoming Orky. All of it pressed against his consciousness with renewed force. He had survived the battle, but in surviving, he had lost something he could never get back. He had become what the Imperium would rightfully judge him to be. A threat, a corrupted machine, a Grey Knight's Dreadnought turned against humanity, and the horror of it was that he was still alive to know what he had become. The point of no return. After the ambush, Caledon's status within the Ork warband changed. He was no longer just a project in Gritstomper's workshop. He was battle-tested loot, a proven weapon, a trophy that demonstrated the mech boss's skill at making captured equipment work. The Orks treated him with a rough respect now, the same way they might treat a particularly effective shooter or a lucky vehicle. This meant more modifications, more improvements, more corruption layered upon corruption. Gritstomper decided the Dreadnought needed proper kill markings to commemorate its first battle. Orks painted crude tallies on the chassis, one mark for each Imperial vehicle destroyed, each soldier killed. Caledon was forced to watch through his optical sensors as the greenskins defaced his armor with symbols celebrating his unwilling slaughter of Imperial forces. They added trophies too. Parts torn from destroyed Imperial equipment were welded to his chassis as decorations. A Chimera's track link here, a broken lasgun there. A guardsman's helmet, still bearing the regimental insignia, mounted on his shoulder plate like a grotesque ornament. Each addition was another layer of shame, another visible reminder of what he had been forced to do. But the physical modifications were minor compared to what was happening to his consciousness. The battle had done something to him, had changed something fundamental about how he related to the corruption. Before, he had been purely resistant, fighting against every influence the Gestalt field imposed. Now, having once surrendered to its pressure, having once worked with the Orky systems instead of against them, he found the resistance harder to maintain. It was like a dam that had developed a small crack. The first breach had been minor, barely noticeable, but water was flowing through that crack now, widening it, making it easier for more water to follow. Each time he accepted Orky logic, each time he found himself thinking in greenskin terms, each time he acknowledged that their modifications actually worked, the crack grew wider. He began to notice himself using Ork words in his internal thoughts. Not the full barbaric language, but individual terms that had worked their way into his consciousness through constant exposure. A weapon was Daka. An engine was gubbins. Something impressive was brutal or proper. They were small linguistic corruptions, but they represented something larger, his mind adapting to think in patterns compatible with Ork cognition. Worse, he was beginning to perceive the Gestalt field not as an assault, but as an environment. Like a fish adapting to water, or a human adjusting to high altitude. His consciousness was learning to function within the psychic pressure of greenskin belief. He was becoming acclimated to it, finding ways to work with it rather than against it. This created a terrible paradox. The more he adapted, the better he functioned within his corrupted chassis. The better he functioned, the more effective he became as a weapon for the Orks. The more effective he became, the stronger the Gestalt field grew around him, reinforcing the Orks' belief that their modifications were working perfectly. It was a feedback loop, each cycle pushing him further from what he had been and closer to what the greenskins wanted him to become. And through it all, he remained aware. That was perhaps the cruelest aspect. He was not being mind-controlled or possessed. His consciousness remained his own. Even as it was being reshaped by forces beyond his control, he knew what was happening to him, could recognize each step in his degradation, could see the path leading toward a destination where brother ancient Caledon would exist only as a fading memory in a mind that thought like an Ork. 5 weeks after his capture, the Warband received reports of another Imperial presence on the world. A Space Marine strike force had landed in the northern continent, investigating the loss of contact with the Guard Regiment. The Orks were ecstatic. Space Marines meant better loot, tougher fights, and the ultimate trophy if they could bring one down. Gritstomper immediately began preparing the Warband for a major engagement. This would not be a simple ambush like the attack on the Guard column. This would be a real battle. Ork and Space Marine fighting in the way both species understood best. Direct, brutal, and to the death. Caledon listened to the preparations with mounting dread. He did not know which chapter had sent the strike force, but it did not matter. Any Space Marine was a battle brother, a warrior dedicated to the same cause he had served for 17 centuries. The thought of fighting Astartes, of raising his weapons against the Emperor's chosen, was almost more than his battered psyche could endure. But he had no choice. The Orks would send him into battle, and his survival instinct would make him fight. He knew this now, had learned it during the ambush. When faced with destruction, he would choose survival, no matter the cost to his soul. Unless he could find a way to communicate with the Space Marines. Unless he could somehow send a message, warn them of what he was, beg them to destroy him before he was forced to harm them. It was his only chance at redemption, his only hope of ending this nightmare in a way that did not make him a permanent enemy of the Imperium. He began working on the communication systems that the Orks had damaged. It was delicate work, made harder by the fact that he had to do it through the scrambled neural interfaces and corrupted control systems. Every adjustment required complex mental calculations, translating his intentions through layers of Orky modifications to achieve the actual effects he wanted. The task took him 3 days of constant effort, during which he had to hide what he was doing from the Orks who occasionally checked on him. He pretended to be in standby mode, a dormant machine waiting for activation, while secretly rerouting power through damaged circuits and attempting to repair broken connections. Finally, he managed to restore partial transmit capability. It was not much, barely enough to send a few seconds of audio before the system would overheat and fail, but it might be enough. If he could time it right, if he could get a message out during the battle, if the Space Marines were listening on the right frequencies, then maybe, just maybe, they would understand. He prepared his message carefully. It had to be short, had to identify him clearly, and had to convey the essential truth of his situation. After several attempts, he settled on words that felt right. "This is Brother Ancient Caledon of the Grey Knights, 8th Brotherhood. I am imprisoned within a corrupted Dreadnought chassis, captured and modified by Orks. I cannot control my actions. Request immediate termination. The Emperor protects." Simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand. If any Space Marine heard that message, they would know what to do. They would bring every weapon to bear, would eliminate the threat he represented, would end his corrupted existence with bolt and blade. It would be a mercy. The day of the battle arrived. The Ork warband mobilized with the sort of chaotic energy that only greenskins could generate. Hundreds of boys piled into transports. Vehicles roared to life with sounds that suggested imminent mechanical failure, and weird boys began channeling the building psychic energy toward offensive purposes. Caledon was loaded onto a transport at the front of the column. Grit Stomper wanted his looted Stompy visible, wanted to show off their captured war machine to the beakies they were about to fight. The mech boss was particularly excited because he had just finished installing what he called a proper big shooter to replace the destroyed assault cannon. The weapon was an Ork heavy bolter, crude and loud, but it worked after a fashion. As the warband moved out, Caledon monitored the Vox frequencies, listening for any sign of Space Marine communications. He heard nothing at first, just the usual Imperial Guard chatter and civilian traffic. Then, as they approached the battle zone, he detected it. Tactical communications in Astartes battle cant, spoken in the clipped, efficient tones that Space Marines use during operations. They were Ultramarines, he realized from the communication protocols. A full company, deployed to investigate the Guard Regiment's destruction and to eliminate the Ork threat. They had no idea they were about to face one of their corrupted brothers, a Grey Knight's Dreadnought turned into an Orky war machine. He waited for the right moment to transmit his message, forcing himself to remain calm despite the screaming anxiety that filled his consciousness. Too early, and the Space Marines might dismiss it as Ork trickery. Too late, and he might be destroyed before he could warn them. The timing had to be perfect. The Orks and Ultramarines met on an open plain that had once been farmland. The Space Marines had established a defensive position around a small settlement, fortifying buildings and preparing firing lanes with the tactical brilliance that defined the sons of Guilliman. The Orks, predictably, charged straight at them with maximum enthusiasm and minimum strategy. Caledon's Dreadnought was positioned near the front of the Ork advance. Grit Stomper wanted the Stompy visible, wanted it to draw fire and attention, wanted the Space Marines to see what the Orks had managed to loot. It was pure greenskin showmanship, the sort of thing that made sense only to those who valued bragging rights over tactical advantage. As the Ork horde closed to within firing range, the Ultramarines opened up with devastating precision. Bolt rounds screamed across the plain, each one finding a target with the accuracy that defined Astartes' marksmanship. Orks fell in droves, but more kept coming, their numbers and enthusiasm carrying them forward despite horrific casualties. And then, as Caledon had feared and hoped, an ultramarine spotted the Dreadnought among the Ork ranks. The Space Marine's voice crackled across the Vox, professional and controlled despite the chaos of battle. "Contact, enemy Dreadnought, designated target Epsilon, appears to be corrupted or looted Imperial chassis. All units, engage with heavy weapons, priority target." This was it. This was the moment. Caledon activated his repaired transmitter, pushing power through the damaged system, feeling it begin to overheat immediately as he forced it to function one last time. His message, the words he had prepared, the plea for mercy through termination, began to broadcast on all Astartes' frequencies. "This is Brother Ancient Caledon of the Grey." The transmitter failed. Not gradually, not after completing the message, but immediately. The system, already damaged beyond proper function, simply gave out under the strain. The broadcast cut off mid-sentence, leaving only a fragment of his warning transmitted. But it was enough. The Ultramarines heard a voice claiming to be a Grey Knight, emanating from what appeared to be an Ork Dreadnought. Confusion rippled through their tactical net. Officers demanded clarification. Tech Marines suggested it might be a recording, a psychological warfare tactic by the Xenos. A librarian reported sensing something strange about the psychic emanations from the target, something that did not match standard Ork profiles. The Ultramarine commander, a veteran captain whose name Caledon caught as Ventris, made a command decision. "All units, hold fire on target Epsilon pending investigation. Maintain engagement with primary Ork forces. Brother librarian, attempt psychic contact with the source of that transmission." Hope surged through Caledon's consciousness. They had heard him. They were investigating. Maybe, just maybe, they would understand and would grant him the death he sought. He tried to prepare himself for psychic contact, tried to organize his thoughts into something coherent, despite the chaos of the gestalt field around him. But the Orks had other ideas. Grit Stomper, seeing the Space Marine's fire shift away from the looted Stompy, interpreted it as fear. The Beakies were scared of their captured Dreadnought. This was perfect. He bellowed orders for Caledon to advance, to get closer, to make the Yumis even more scared. The Gestalt field pushed at Caledon's consciousness, reinforcing the mech boss's commands with psychic weight. The Orks all wanted to see their Stompy crush some Space Marines. Their collective belief that this should happen began to assert itself on reality, making the path forward seem right and proper and natural. And Caledon, with his resistance already weakened, with his will already compromised by weeks of corruption, found himself advancing. His Dreadnought chassis moved forward, stomping toward the Ultramarine position with heavy mechanical strides. He tried to stop himself, tried to force his corrupted body to halt, but the Gestalt field was too strong now, reinforced by hundreds of Orks all focused on the same goal. Through his optical sensors, he could see Ultramarines repositioning to face him, could see their weapons tracking his approach, could see one Space Marine wearing the psychic hood of a librarian, stepping forward and raising a hand toward him in a gesture that suggested psychic contact was imminent. And then, before the librarian could establish a link, before Caledon could communicate the truth of his situation, disaster struck. A weird boy in the Ork horde, channeling too much psychic energy from the Gestalt field, lost control of the power he was wielding. The greenskin's head exploded in a shower of green energy that arced across the battlefield, striking friend and foe alike. One particularly strong bolt hit Caledon's Dreadnought, overloading his already damaged systems and causing a cascade failure across his neural connections. The pain was indescribable. Every sensor overloaded simultaneously. Every neural link fired random signals. Every system that connected his mind to the machine went haywire. For a terrible moment, Caledon lost all sense of where he was, what he was, even who he was. His consciousness scattered across the corrupted machine's systems like debris from an explosion. When awareness returned, seconds or minutes later, he found his Dreadnought had gone fully autonomous. The machine's simple cogitator brain, designed to handle basic functions when the pilot was incapacitated, had taken control. But this cogitator had been modified by the Orks, influenced by the Gestalt field, programmed with Orky combat routines. Without Caledon's conscious control, without his will restraining its actions, the Dreadnought did what Ork machines did when left to their own devices. It attacked the nearest enemy with maximum violence. The Ork heavy bolter opened fire on the Ultramarines, spraying the Space Marines' position with a storm of shells. The Dreadnought's power fist swung at anything that got close, crushing Ork and Ultramarine alike in its autonomous rampage. It was berserk, out of control, exactly the sort of thing the Orks expected from a properly brutal stompy. Caledon, his consciousness struggling to reassert control over his body, could only watch helplessly through fragmented sensor feeds as his Dreadnought killed Space Marines. 3 Ultramarines fell to the heavy bolter fire, their armor breached by sustained fire. A 4th was caught by the power fist and crushed into paste. A 5th was trampled as the Dreadnought stomped forward with mechanical indifference. And through it all, the librarian who had been trying to establish psychic contact was also trying to reach Caledon's consciousness, to confirm whether there really was a Grey Knight trapped inside this machine. But the Gestalt field, the Ork modifications, the cascade of system failures, all of it created a psychic noise so intense that the librarian could not penetrate it. All he could sense was violence, corruption, and the overwhelming impression of Orky presence. The librarian's conclusion, shouted across the tactical net, was damning. No loyalist presence detected. The transmission was either a recording or a lie. This is a corrupted machine, possibly possessed. Eliminate it immediately. The Ultramarines responded with the full weight of their arsenal. Lascannons fired, their beams cutting deep into the Dreadnought's armor. Missile launchers spoke, their warheads impacting with earth-shaking force. Melter weapons were brought to bear, their superheated beams designed specifically to destroy heavy armor. Caledon, finally regaining control of his systems, felt the Dreadnought's structure beginning to fail under the concentrated fire. This was it. This was the death he had sought, delivered by the Emperor's finest warriors. It should have been a relief, should have been a mercy. But survival instinct, that terrible drive that had kept him fighting for 17 centuries, activated one final time. Without his conscious thought, without his permission, his systems implemented emergency evasion protocols. His Dreadnought lurched backward, moving with the unnatural speed that the Ork modifications and Gestalt field allowed. He retreated from the Ultramarine position, stumbling back toward the Ork lines, even as his consciousness screamed for him to stand still and die. The Orks, interpreting the retreat as a strategic withdrawal, laid down covering fire to protect their looted stompy. The Ultramarines, unable to pursue through the wall of Ork shooters and rockets, continued to engage the main greenskin horde. The moment of truth had passed, and Caledon was still alive. As his Dreadnought was pulled back into the Ork formation, as Gritstomper checked him for damage and praised his fighting, as the Gestalt field washed over him with approval for surviving the Space Marines' assault, Caledon understood with terrible clarity what had just happened. He had killed Ultramarines. He had tried to warn them and failed. He had sought death and been denied. And worst of all, he had proven to the Space Marines that the transmission was false, that this was just an Ork machine, that no Grey Knight dwelt within its corrupted shell. If his chapter ever learned of this battle, if they ever discovered that Brother Ancient Caledon's Dreadnought chassis had been seen fighting for Orks against Ultramarines, they would declare him excommunicate. They would list him among the fallen, among those who had betrayed their oaths. His name would be stricken from the rolls of honor, his deeds forgotten, his 17 centuries of service erased as if they had never been, and they would be right to do so. Because whatever he had been, whatever he had fought for, whatever oaths he had sworn, none of it mattered anymore. He was what the evidence suggested, a corrupted machine, a weapon turned against the Imperium, a Grey Knight who had failed the ultimate test. The Orks continued their battle, eventually being driven off by the Ultramarines' superior tactics and firepower. But the Greenskins counted it as a win anyway, because they had survived, had looted some good stuff from dead Space Marines, and their captured Stompy had proved itself in a real fight against Beakies. Gritstomper spent the journey back to their base, praising Caledon's Dreadnought for its performance. The mech boss talked about new modifications, about bigger weapons, about making the Stompy even more brutal for the next battle. But Caledon barely heard him. His consciousness had retreated to the deepest recesses of his mind, hiding from the reality of what he had become. He no longer recited litanies or reviewed Grey Knight's history. He no longer tried to maintain his identity against the Gestalt field's erosion. He simply existed. A awareness trapped in a machine, waiting for oblivion that would never come. The point of no return had passed. Brother Ancient Caledon of the Grey Knights, 8th Brotherhood, was lost. What remained was just a ghost, haunting a corrupted shell that served the enemies of everything he had once held sacred. Conclusion: the unending nightmare. This, then, is the fate of a Grey Knight's Dreadnought captured by Orks after 1750 years of sleep. It is not a quick death or a clean destruction. It is not even corruption in the traditional sense, where a warrior turns traitor or succumbs to chaos. It is something more insidious, more terrible, more fitting for the grim dark horror that defines Warhammer 40,000. It is the slow erosion of identity through practical necessity. The gradual surrender of principles in the face of survival. The transformation of a sacred defender into an unwilling instrument of violence against those he swore to protect. And perhaps worst of all, it is the complete awareness of every step in that transformation. The consciousness forced to watch itself change while being powerless to prevent it. The Orks do not understand what they have done. To them, it is simply successful looting, the capture and repurposing of enemy equipment in the way they have done countless times before. They see a Stompy that works, a weapon that fights, a trophy that proves their mech boss's skill. They are proud of their achievement, pleased with how well the Yumi pilot has adapted to his new role. The Imperium, if they ever learn of this, will see only corruption and betrayal. They will see a Grey Knight's Dreadnought fighting alongside Xenos, killing Imperial soldiers and Space Marines. They will draw the only conclusion that their doctrine allows, that Brother Ancient Caledon fell from grace, that his 17 centuries of service mean nothing in the face of his final failure. But the truth is more terrible than either the Orcs' ignorance or the Imperium's judgment. The truth is that Caledon never chose this, never wanted it, never stopped fighting against it, even as he was forced to cooperate with it for the sake of survival. The truth is that he is a victim, not a traitor, a prisoner, not a turncoat, a tortured consciousness screaming inside a corrupted shell, unable to escape or die or be heard. And the nightmare continues, because the Orks will keep using him. Will keep sending him into battle against Imperial forces. Will keep making modifications that push him further from what he was. Will keep surrounding him with their Gestalt field, slowly rewriting his consciousness through the sheer persistence of their belief. Every battle will add more kill markings to his chassis. Every fight will strengthen the Orcs' conviction that their looted Stompy is properly Orky now. Every day will erode another piece of who he used to be. Eventually, perhaps in decades or centuries, the last fragments of Brother Ancient Caledon's identity will fade completely. What remains will be something that was once a Grey Knight, once a defender of humanity, once a warrior of unshakable faith. But those memories will be dim and distant, like stories heard in childhood, no longer carrying real meaning or weight. The consciousness that remains will have adapted fully to Orky existence, will think in their terms, will fight in their way, will be for all practical purposes, one of them despite the human flesh still floating in amniotic fluid within the sarcophagus. It will be the ultimate corruption, achieved not through the promises of chaos or the seduction of power, but through simple adaptation to circumstances beyond control. This is the horror at the heart of this scenario. Not that the Orks captured a dreadnought, for such things happen in war. Not that they modified it to work for them, for the greenskins are skilled looters. But that in doing so, they created something that should not exist. A loyal servant of the Emperor, transformed against his will into a weapon that murders his own brothers, all while remaining fully aware of the betrayal his survival forces him to commit. There is no rescue coming for Brother Ancient Caledon. The Grey Knights believe him dead, destroyed in battle with honor. The Ultramarines who encountered him reported a corrupted machine, not a prisoner to be saved. The Imperium's vast bureaucracy has already processed his loss and moved on to other concerns. No one is looking for him. No one knows he needs saving. No one understands that the Ork Dreadnought, stomping across battlefields, is piloted by one of humanity's greatest defenders. And even if they did know, even if by some miracle the truth was discovered, what could they do? The corruption is not something that can be cleansed by ritual or prayer. The Orky modifications are not just physical additions that can be removed. The Gestalt field's influence has permeated every aspect of his existence, changing neural pathways, rewriting patterns of thought, reshaping the very consciousness it was meant to enslave. A rescue attempt would find only a machine that fights with Ork tactics and space marine skill, a chassis covered in Xenos symbols and Imperial honors, a consciousness that can barely remember its own name. The most merciful thing would be to destroy him, to end his suffering with bolt and flame. But even that mercy is denied, because his captors see no reason to free their valuable looted Stompy, and his would-be rescuers have no idea he needs rescuing. So the nightmare continues, will continue, has no end in sight. Brother Ancient Caledon, who once stood guard over the Emperor's realm, who banished greater demons and sealed warp rifts, who served with honor for 17 centuries, has been reduced to this, a screaming consciousness in a corrupted shell, forced to murder his own people while his captors cheer and his victims see only an enemy to be destroyed. It is a fate worse than death, worse than corruption, worse than any torment demons could devise. Because through it all, he remains aware, remains himself, even as he stops being himself, remains loyal, even as he is forced into betrayal, remains a Grey Knight in his soul, even as his body serves the enemies of everything the Grey Knights represent. This is the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and no mercy for those who fall, where even the mightiest defenders can be turned into instruments of destruction, where survival itself can become the cruelest punishment. Where consciousness is both prison and prisoner, unable to escape the horror of its own existence. If you found this exploration of Warhammer 40,000's darkest possibilities interesting, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. The universe of 40k is filled with such terrible tales, each one showing us new depths of grimdark horror. There are always more stories to tell, more scenarios to explore, more nightmares waiting in the darkness between the stars. Remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates that transcend death itself, and Brother Ancient Caledon's fate may be the worst of all.